Welcome to le Grand Voyage with Chateau Malottic La Gravière. For before the harvest, as soon as the bud blossoms and the flower becomes a ripening grape, then he will cut off the sprigs with pruning knives and remove and cut away the spreading branches. The book of Isaiah is good for many things, but not necessarily advice on pruning vines. The buds on vines in Bordeaux blossom in April. The region's winemakers could well have started their pruning almost 6 months earlier, and they'll be well finished by the time the bud blossoms. Most chateaux will have pruned in the vine's dormant phase. It's during the coldest parts of the year, February and March. Pruning is one of the most important tasks in a vine grower's year, and it needs to be done well and in good time, because once the cold weather stops, you want to have stopped pruning too. You can't begin the process until the leaves have all fallen off the vines. That way you can get into the tangle of canes and branches. Also, it's essential that the sap has stopped rising in the vine. This means that once the workers start cutting off the previous season's wood, the vine won't drip sap. It's variously described as weeping or bleeding, just to give some idea of how vineyard workers imagine their vines feel. The process takes several stages. First, you have to remove the staples that have clipped the vine branches onto the wires. These staples help support the branches when they're heavy with leaves and grapes in the summer. Then you have to lower the trellis wires so that you can get into that stalky canopy. Only then can you start cutting away, all done by hand, hunched over, up and down endless rows of vines. This isn't like pruning a rose around the door of an English country cottage. Here you've to cut through half-inch thick canes, tens of thousands of them, in vineyards approaching freezing with the wind whipping in from the Gironde estuary. And all of these vines standing at roughly the hunched-over height familiar to anyone who's slipped a disc picking up a toddler. You have to remove a mass of wood. Your goal is to craft the vine into a neat shape and force it to concentrate its energy into a few perfectly positioned bunches of grapes. Huge piles of wood build up between the rows of vines. The vineyard workers can cut off as much as 90% of the previous year's new growth. It sounds brutal, but it's essential. The best grapes grow on 1-year-old wood, and the buds that produce the shoots that will become canes grow from the 1-year-old canes from the previous year. Pruning affects the following harvest, and in turn it begins the process of the harvest the year after that. The skill of the pruner is in knowing which cane to keep and which ones to cut off, looking for the canes that have enjoyed the most sun last summer and those that will have the perfect balance of sunlight, position and shade next summer. What happens if you don't prune a vine like this? Well, for the answer, it's worth a visit to Hampton Court Palace, just west of London. The great vine there was planted in 1768 by the celebrated gardener Lancelot Capability Brown. Today it's the largest vine in the world. Its branches extend almost 37 metres, that's more than 120 feet. Each year this single vine produces somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of a ton of grapes. You can buy the grapes in the palace shop. This is thanks to King Edward VII, who decided that they were no longer needed by the royal household. Although his mother, Queen Victoria, had been a fan, she had the grapes sent to wherever she was staying. If you buy some, you'll find they're delicious, but for eating, not for winemaking. The variety isn't one for winemaking, but also the grapes don't have the freshness and acidity, the thick skins or the concentration that you need to make good wine. So you need to prune. While the grape vine produces well over 1,000 bunches of grapes, a Bordeaux vine might produce 8. But after all that cutting, your work in the vineyard is not yet done. It's time for the tirage des bois, removing the wood. The tireurs are workers who clear the rows of vines of the wood cut by the pruners. It's shredded or burnt and then spread back onto the vineyard to add minerals and nutrients back into the soils. It's also fabulous for barbecues. Christian Seeley of Chateau Pichon Baron has a delicious recipe for lamb roasted over piles of vine canes. And then, in March, it's time for palissage, that's the trellising. This means replacing any posts damaged by weather or machinery, restringing wires, tightening others, and often with a thing called a gripple made in Sheffield. It's the joy of every Yorkshireman like me that most vineyards in the world seem to have little pieces of Yorkshire in them. Once that's all done, the team pass through and attach the vines to their stakes on the lowest wire, and the vintage begins again. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it, so it may bear more fruit. As it happens, the Gospel of John has some excellent pruning advice. And we'll be back again tomorrow with more advice and stories from Bordeaux with Le Grand Voyage.